Hello, void and all who inhabit it. It's me, and Happy New Year. New year, old content. Kind of. I actually wasn't going to do this, and then my hold at the library was finally fulfilled, so I was able to read the book, and after doing so, have a lot of thoughts. Spoiler alert, as always, I'm going to be talking about the plot of Lovecraft Country, both the show and the book, in depth, in detail. If you haven't seen either one of them, proceed with caution. Like I said, after reading the book, the inconsistencies of the characters in the show version stuck out even more to me. And here we are. Illustratively, it feels like every writer has their own headcanon for each character, and not only do they not match up, but the show doesn't make the effort to bridge the gap between different depictions of the same character from episode to episode, versus the book, which is all written by one person who has a consistent idea of how he wants each character to pop up. I'm going to timestamp when I talk about whomst if you want to skip ahead, but before I get into each character, I want to point out some major changes from the book to the show that I think have a huge impact both on who the characters are and on the plot of the story as a whole. I have to start with the most glaring difference, which is that the book is much nicer to white people. The show does a much better job of handling race, racial trauma, the catharsis one might need in those types of experiences than the book does. And I'm going to point this out multiple times going forward. I have to, okay? It was a lot reading the book at times, but I just want to point out now, before we get into the 17 times I'm going to reference it, that the show did it better. The book is also slower. Several chapters take place over several days versus the show that has multiple episodes that just take place over one day. Pacing of character development is also slower but better in the book. While the character arcs are shallow, okay, we're talking kiddie pool, the growth that the characters go through makes sense based off of who they are, what values they hold, what motivates them, and the book does a better job of building that up than the show does. On one hand, you could say that it's because, for example, Diana's episode takes place over one day versus Horace, who is the book version of that character. His chapter takes place over several days, so there's literally more time in the book to get to know Horace. But you should be able to build out a character, not just in their specific episode, but in the show as a whole. You should know how you want to pace that character's arc and be able to do so effectively. With Diana specifically, we do get to see her a little bit before her episode, but most of the main characters have major changes in their personality seemingly occur off screen. Speaking of Diana, I think the most well-known change from the book to the show is that Caleb and Horace become Christina and Diana. I will look more at the impact for those characters specifically when I get to them, but I will say that although the show makes more of its characters female, they don't write them that much better. Or rather, they don't write them to be strong characters. There are a few relationship changes specifically that cut from characters who all end up women in the show. Dee and Ruby's relationship is pretty much removed. Ruby and Letty's relationship is weakened. Atticus and Letty's relationship is centered. Ruby's relationship with Christina is a thing that we'll get to, but it's a thing. With relationships, there are also some major changes to family dynamics that, again, impact both the plot and the way the characters are developed. In the book, George and Montrose have different fathers. Dora is a single child of a single mother who is disconnected from her family, and Montrose met her in DC. Ruby and Letty have the same father and talk more about their mother, and William is not related to the Braithwaites. In the show, George and Montrose have the same father, and the show chooses for that father to be the abusive Mr. Turner as opposed to the softer Mr. Barry. Dora lived next door to Montrose and George and knew her whole family. Ruby and Letty mention very little of their past other than broad sweeping statements that suggest their mother was selfish. And I don't know who the fuck William really is, girl. He looks related to Christina and Samuel, but like, who is he? Who? It's never really made clear who he is. And I think that if he was Samuel Braithwaite's son, like, that would have stuck out to people more. Whatever. Despite being a minor character, it's Dora and the changes made to her character that actually have the biggest impact. I'm going to talk about this more later, but the shift in who Dora is greatly impacts Montrose's motivation, which in turn impacts the plot. Dora's family structure is somewhat flipped with Ruby and Letty's. The sisters become the children of a single mother, while Dora gets to know her whole family and is the girl next door. The changes that are made feel like they are meant to signal who is morally good, which again I'll get into more at the end of this video. In the book, George and Montrose having different fathers is used to explain a bit of the difference in their temperament, something which feels consistent to the way Ruby and Letty are set up, although a bit more subtly. While with Dora, she has to remain this ethereal, angelic, delicate yet strong, rock-hard pillar of truth of a woman. And for some reason, that includes her growing up in a home that's more than just her and her mother. I get that there are a lot of depictions of Black single mothers as violent and incompetent and just overall bad. And I get wanting to avoid that by showing a complete family unit, but you don't have to in order to show a positive family life. You know, dynamics that aren't the norm aren't inherently bad just because most of the ways that we have been shown them have been negative. Admittedly, I think the writing that led up to and through episode 9 wasn't very good, and that we could have explored the past differently, perhaps in a way that didn't involve burning grandmothers. Just a thought. There's an importance in telling stories about bits of history that are left out, but I wonder how much of that requires recreating violence. I think part of the motivation in changing Dora's family setup was to show the intimate emotional impact of racial violence, but don't Black people already know that? Like, who does it serve to have to see that? As much as you could argue for or against continuing to show single Black mothers, you could argue for or against continuing to talk about horrific historical events by showing the violence firsthand, you know? I don't know. This isn't a fully fleshed out thought, admittedly, but something that's been spinning in my mind in regards to a lot of these changes, but particularly the change with Dora, is who does it serve? What's the purpose of seeing her family die? What's the purpose in framing Dora as someone who grew up next to and experienced a great trauma with Montrose and George and bonded with them through that, especially because none of that is explored. We're just told that that's what happened, versus just having her and Montrose meet in college and having Montrose and George still be from Tulsa and still experiencing that separately. What's the point beyond the plot? Anyway, time traveling to see Dora brings me to two other big changes from the book. The first is that the book has a much better handling of the rules of magic, which, other than making the plot just make so much more sense, it helps explain why certain characters can or can't do certain things that would or wouldn't put them in different places in a way that is more cohesive than just plot armor. Notably, Montrose's feelings about magic, what they should bother to dabble with, what they should bother to tell Caleb Braithwaite they know, are more fleshed out so that his arc and his growth to getting to the point where he is willing to use magic at the end makes more sense. The book also has more markers of wealth and class. Montrose and George are in the Freemasons, which any type of fraternal organization, that's money, okay? You will be paying dues regularly. Montrose stresses that Tick needs to use the GI Bill to go to college, which is a loaded conversation for a Black veteran so close to World War II, and especially coming from a character like Montrose, who is so distrustful of white people and the government, but it's something that he stresses Tick needs to do. And Atticus and Hippolyta have their own cars, bringing the family total of automobiles to 3. These are all noticeably missing from the show. I think in part it is to fix anachronistic styling, but these changes also strip characters of having a life outside of what's currently happening to them. Namely, again, Montrose. He is removed from his connection to his community when he is removed from the Freemasons and no longer has a job in the show. The only people we see Montrose interacting with other than his family are Sammy and the one museum guard. For Atticus and Hippolyta, having their own cars means they're often on guide trips, which is used to explain why they aren't around for a certain part of the story. This isn't to say that the show needed to recreate this middle to upper middle class type of lifestyle, but in moving away from these clear trappings of class, I think the writers also pulled characters out of their environment. We don't know what they could be doing when they aren't actively participating in the story, so it feels like story progression on characters is paused until we need them again. It's very Sims 2. The last thing I'll point out is a difference in structure. I really enjoyed in the book that each chapter focuses solely and completely on the character whose chapter it is. Ruff does not carve out huge chunks of Hippolyta's story for a B plot. For example, we experience the world through Hippolyta and how she is experiencing it only. And if any other main character happens to be a part of her chapter, it's because they are playing a part in that chapter's story, not because we are diverting away to focus on them. Episode 6, which is Gia's episode, is the one most in line with the structure of the book, which is ironic because Gia doesn't exist in the book at all. And with that, let's get into these characters, starting with, of course, Atticus, aka the most inconsequential main character of all time, which is funny because the show makes every single person's story have to revolve around him by the end. I will say, the show did do a better job of filling him out than the book, and interestingly, there are some key lines he has that are switched with other characters, Uncle George specifically. In the book, he is very much a lone wolf, kind of brash type of hero in the very brief times that we see him, and I get why the writers of the show were like, we would prefer for him to have a more Ari Lennox moment in his character arc.
Realized, oh my God, I need people.
But like, what does he do? What do you do well? You know, who is Atticus? He to me, he's kind of just there, you know? I mentioned in my full season review that I didn't like that Gia forgave Atticus so quickly in her episode. And I still feel that way, but in writing this whole production, I realized that my main issue is that the inconsistency of the entire season meant that some characters, either their whole arcs or noticeable portions of it, had to be truncated because the ideas of who the characters are varied so greatly based on who is writing. There's no guarantee that the thread of the impact of the war on Atticus will be followed to the next time we see him, because the writer of the next episode might be more interested in his relationship with Montrose. A writer's whole headcanon has to be crammed into one episode, and the next episode we get may be noticeably different. With Atticus, the end result is a character who is very bland. I had wondered why they made the decision to kill Atticus in the end. I can kind of see the potential rationale with Uncle George, but with Atticus, you know, what's the point? Especially if you want to come back to this story, why kill off the main character? And truly, I think it was an effort of emotional appeal. But despite him being the main character, I don't think our emotional connection to Atticus was really built up through the show. So it didn't work. It didn't work, girl. Nice try. Maybe next time. You know who also had a horrible emotional connection built up throughout the show? Montrose. I surprisingly not surprisingly, I'm scrolling through a whole lot of words right now. I have less to say about Montrose than I thought, but he is what fueled my desire to write this whole thing, because that character, child, terrible. Terrible, Yana. He is terrible. In the book, Montrose has more to his personhood than just being Atticus's father. I feel like everything about Montrose in the show, including his feelings about his sexuality, have to tie back to Atticus. But who is he when he's not revolving around Tick? Episode 5 is the only time we get to see Montrose exist without the purpose of being observed, and it's so poorly timed. I will say that the book doesn't seem to be aware of Montrose's abuse and abusive behavior, even though he is written as someone with more to him. Montrose is abrasive and aggressive. He randomly slaps up someone's child on the street because he can. And the book is kind of just like, that's my dad. And I'll say this a lot. I see why the writers wanted to change the tone of how this character was portrayed in the book version. For Montrose specifically, that meant a focus on his relationship with Tick as a way to question abusive or negative parenting techniques that are normalized. But that became all his character was about, really, and I don't think it was given all they said it was supposed to have gave. We can see that the decision to kill Uncle George is directly connected to this exploration through Montrose's character. In doing so, the writers force Montrose as the only father figure that we're seeing for the entirety of the show, and the main parental relationship to focus on. We do see Hippolyta interacting with Dee late in the season, but the majority of what we're looking at is how Montrose behaves with Tick. I will say I wouldn't have picked up on what they were trying to do if I didn't start listening to the podcast. And I only started listening to the podcast because Montrose killed Yahima, and I was like, why would you do that? And the answer was, well, he did it to protect Tick. And I was like, where in the source material does it say that, honey? I think they tried to fit too much into Montrose when they could have just kept Uncle George alive, which would have allowed him to work as a foil to Montrose and have that as a means of having these conversations about parental-child relationships, as well as providing understanding of who Montrose is as a person, as opposed to just who Montrose is as a father, through seeing how Montrose interacts with his brother, somewhat like we get in the book. Montrose instead feels like the epitome of the writers reconstructing a character from episode to episode. What motivates him changes depending on what's needed for the plot. A prime example of this is the shift from episode 5, where Atticus beats Montrose after he pieces together that Montrose killed Yahima, to episode 7, where Atticus and Letty happily bop up to Montrose's apartment to ask him for something, and in the process catch him with Sammy. I think we're supposed to be watching this as if some interactions happen off screen that justify why Atticus would feel comfortable enough to come ask his father for help, but I needed to see that, because otherwise it doesn't make sense to me that the last time I saw these two characters interacting, it was hella violent, and now everything is seemingly okay enough for you to just go to his house to ask for help, which only begets more violence. Add on top of that the last time Montrose helped them, it was because Letty asked, and even that was like pulling teeth. It kind of just doesn't make sense why Atticus would go ask his father for help, or why Montrose would even be willing to, had he not been caught with Sammy, arguably. Other thing that really bothers me with Montrose's inconsistency is that a lot of his behavior doesn't matter. Killing Yahima, burning the bylaws book, doing whatever the fuck he was doing to have gotten kidnapped in the first place. Who fucking cares? What does it matter? It doesn't. Beyond that making the plot really difficult to follow, it also makes Montrose's character arc murky. If he's making these dramatic actions that end up not mattering, that he doesn't have to answer for, that we don't see him come back to process, what are we supposed to glean as motivating him? What are we supposed to see as the actions that impact who he is and who he is becoming over the course of the story, if what he's doing only matters for 10 minutes afterwards? For example, in the book, the reason why Montrose got kidnapped is that both he and Caleb were looking for information about Hannah, who was Tick's ancestor that ran from the Burning Lodge. We learned that Montrose, as a genealogy nerd, promised his wife that he would research her family history, which eventually led him to the story about Hannah. We also learned that while Dora initially thought that this was a nice gesture from Montrose, his fixation became a frequent point of conflict between the two of them. And even though she asked him repeatedly to stop, he continued to research even after her death. Through this, we aren't just given substance to the plot, but a stronger idea of who Montrose is, how he behaves, and an aspect of what drives him. His motivation didn't need to be the same in the show, but it needed to be as strongly established. Because it isn't, he isn't rounded, but rather a shell through which to send messaging. There is, as mentioned, Montrose's relationship with Tick as an examination of toxic parental relationships. Kind of. Their relationship is healed once Montrose tells him the story of the lobotomized pastor as the root of his fear, to which Tick responds by sharing that Letty is pregnant, and Montrose promises to protect them all. Then Montrose, who would have literally preferred to destroy any potential information about anything magical, reads an incantation for Tick's benefit. Development? Who is she? We don't know her. There is also his speech to Dee in episode 8, which I think is fitting for this examination of parental behavior and does make sense for his character. But, and I'll talk about this more with Dee, it doesn't make sense for Montrose to have been the adult that cared the most for her in that episode. His behavior in this episode feels like a way to send a message. As we move further through the season, Montrose moves closer to becoming the doting archetypal father, which it's not that I don't want Montrose to get better, but I want the change and growth to make sense. After he kills Yahima, we only see him fighting with Tick until episode 8, where Tick's announcement of Letty's pregnancy shifts Montrose's behavior towards his son. I mentioned this in my full season review, but I hated the idea of the creation of a child being a parent's salvation that's at the core of episode 9. But this idea is actually introduced with the scene between Montrose and Tick in episode before. Tick's salvation is of the utmost importance because he needs to stick around to be a father. And as we will see in episode 9, being a father to a son, no less, is one of the best things you could be in Montrose's eyes. By the way, how does that track with you being vile towards your son for the majority of the past 7 episodes? Like, are we going to look at that clash at all? No? Okay. The other PSA portion of Montrose's character is his sexuality. As I've already said, even this part of his character has to tie back to Tick. Both how his sexuality impacts his relationship with Tick and with the first suggestions of Montrose being gay being processed through Tick's reactions. Again, episode 5 is the only time we get to see him being himself without being observed. Jade Fox recently did a video about LGBT films, and in it she said, "There's room in 2021 and beyond for LGBT projects that straight people won't understand." Montrose's storyline, especially episode 9, feels like a gay story that is written for straight people to understand. How can we explain what it was like being gay 100 years ago? Oh, I know. Trauma. We can stop that. Also, the myth that the most modern time is the most progressive time is just that, a myth. It's not that shit was great, but the LGBT community didn't just start existing and resisting in 2008 with marriage equality or even in 1969 with Stonewall. There are ways to show queer people, and specifically queer people of color, existing in the past in a way that does not have to center being traumatized. And, like the changes with Dora, I wonder who it serves to see Montrose suffer. Ultimately, this takes me back to the inconsistencies with his character seemingly being driven by whatever needs his character is meant to serve for that episode. It's that aspect of his character that makes the exploration of his sexuality feel cheap and consumable, instead of an integrated part of his character and his story. Overall, Montrose is just meant to do too much, and a major reason for that is because they killed off Uncle George. I know I said in Tick's portion that I understand the rationale in why they killed Uncle George, but that was a lie.
It was all a lie. Guys, it was all a lie. She lied.
Uncle George didn't have to die. And at times it feels like the writers didn't even know what purpose his death was supposed to serve. Hippolyta feels like she isn't being told the truth about his death, but that doesn't really lead anywhere, and her concern is the main driving force in keeping his death relevant. By the end, the most that matters is that Atticus and Letty are going to name their son after him. Because in the book, both Montrose and George survive Artem, we get to see their relationship throughout the story. We see them both as Freemasons, we see them bicker as brothers, and we see their conflicting ideas of how they should raise their children. Again, that last bit alone, I think should have been enough reason to keep Uncle George alive. Then, the whole exploration of parental dynamics, and specifically father-child dynamics, would not have been dumped solely onto Montrose, and we would have had more time to unpack Uncle George the way episode 7 does. Something that isn't explored in the show or the book is the impact their childhood had on George. In the book, George and Montrose have different fathers, and Montrose's father isn't as harsh on George, which is used to explain Montrose's temperament. But what impact does that have on who George became? George being the sibling who wasn't abused isn't as delicate as a narrative to unpack as Montrose's, but it is important, especially with the show adding the angle of both George and Montrose having loved Dora. The relationship between the brothers could have been used as an avenue to have discussions about fatherhood, masculinity, abuse, and trauma that the show was trying to have, so I don't get why they got rid of him. Another major reason why they should have kept George alive was so that we could see his interactions with Diana. Diana is one of two characters whose gender is swapped from the book, with the book version of her character being a son named Horace. For both of them, the main focus of their chapter/episode is being haunted after being cursed by the evil police. But the major difference in their stories is that people actually notice when Horace is struggling. Not enough to do anything, but they care about his health, while no one gives a shit about Dee. I get the message they were trying to send, but it was ill-fitting of all of the characters around Dee to not give a fuck about what was happening to her as she was being chased by nightmare fuel. Beyond that blatant message, I was left questioning what were the writers doing to show care for Dee throughout the narrative. I was looking for more than one scene with a speech layered over it. Something I really liked in the book is that Horace has a moment to share his whole story. At the end, when everyone is recapping their chapter for the good of the group, and the adults are rightfully horrified. I wanted so badly for Dee to get to talk to the adults around her, for them to know and understand what happened to her and why. And the only person to even make an effort is her mother. What about Montrose? Oh, you mean our favorite narrative Swiss Army knife? Other than shoehorning that character into every available crevice, it makes more sense for the person to have cared the most about Dee to be Ruby. In the book, there's a scene when Ruby comes over to watch Horace, which we do get in the show with episode 7, but in the book, Ruby is described as being the only adult other than Horace's parents who support his dream of being an artist, which I think would have been hella fitting considering the show decided to make Ruby a singer with a murky career trajectory. But beyond that, this conversation is what allows Ruby to flag for Caleb, hey, something's going on with Horace and he needs help. As a result, Horace never ends up petrified. In the show, Dee is left all alone, with Montrose being the person who cares the most, even though Ruby is the one who was left in charge whilst her mother was gone. And Montrose's interference leads to Dee being petrified and temporarily comatose because of the curse. The book does have a white savior issue with Caleb, so I get why they got rid of that. What I continue to fail to understand is why Dee had to be all alone and why she had to be jigaboo-fied when it didn't lead to any larger conversation about accountability for the rest of the adults involved. The community failed Dee, but it's only her mother who is held partially responsible. Speaking of community, in the book, Horace is left at home in the end because the adults don't think it's safe for him to participate in the final confrontation, versus Dee, who starts the ride-along sing-along and is left to read a comic in the forest while everyone else is doing fuck all. Dee's episode is meant to be an exploration of childhood being stripped away from Black girls, specifically choosing to take her along to Artem and having her be the one to kill Christina in the final scene of the episode feels incongruous to the message that we are getting in episode 8. Do you see the dissonance in saying Black girls aren't cared for, aren't allowed to be children, and then having that character choke someone to death? If anything, this is a major scene that highlights how this show is a collection of moments instead of a cohesive narrative, because it directly clashes with the idea that we should do something about the fact that Black girls are ignored and forced to grow up too fast. And Dee's behavior does not make any sense for who she is shown to be or grow into, let alone the fact that she doesn't know who Christina is. What happened when Dee got her new arm? You might consider that a rhetorical question, but I like to call it a transition to talk about Hippolyta. She is truly an Amazon in the book, standing 6 feet tall, traveling on her own guide trips. She has no character arc. Her chapter is my least favorite one, which is funny because her episode is my top 2 and it ain't number 2, okay? In the book, Hippolyta finds the observatory, having been gifted the orrery after Letty found it in her house and considered it an eyesore, and she travels through the multiverse. However, the observatory works how I imagine the TARDIS works, in that it travels from planet to planet instead of opening a giant rift in the space-time continuum. Anyway, Hippolyta travels to this planet where she finds a lone woman, Ida, who's been stuck there for 30 years after Hiram, the evil man who's haunting Letty's house, dropped Ida and 4 other house workers there as punishment when his son ran off with one of the maids. Hiram died before he can come back, and the 5 are left on the planet. By the time Hippolyta gets there, everyone but this one woman has died, and the chapter ends with Ida forcing Hippolyta back into the multiverse machine with a killer sentient rock that ends up eating a cop instead of Hippolyta. This chapter has some of the worst handling of race because it sets up who Hiram is, but then wants us to ignore all of this when it comes to asking for his help later in the book, or believing that he'd be amicable to Letty. It also doesn't look at why Ida would be so fearful of Hiram to be distrustful of even another Black woman. You might be like, this has nothing to do with Hippolyta. Yeah, she's tall and goes on guide trips alone. That's about it. Oh, wait, no, she also named Pluto instead of a comet, but that's mostly an introduction to her love of space, which is also reflected in the show pretty well. I think Hippolyta is a character best adapted to the show. The change in her storyline with episode 7 is much more fulfilling and rounded. The end of her storyline with her being a battery for the multiverse machine before the big battle where she does nothing is pretty indicative of my major issue with the characters, which, say it all together now, is the fact that each writer has their own separate ideas for each character and they aren't melded very well together. A character who is melded well together, and it is unfortunately to their detriment, is Letitia, aka Letty, aka Tisha. The show makes her a much more active agent, with some of Atticus's actions being ported onto Letty, but there are big jumps in Letty's characterization that happen after she has sex with Atticus. I've mentioned before that I would have liked to see the building up of that relationship a bit more for plot reasons, but I think it also would have helped with building Letty's character and seeing how she's changing as their journey proceeds. In episode 4, Letty has a moment where she snaps at Atticus and says something along the lines of, "You aren't the only one affected. I died, Montrose is kidnapped." And while that's mostly to set in the tension that leads to their big kiss in the end, I loved that there was finally an acknowledgement of the impact these events are having on who these characters are becoming. We don't see a lot of Letty in the book, so the show really did sculpt most of her character, and I think this scene is one of the biggest, most blatant ways in which they did that. I do want to point out that Letty's chapter in the book, is one of the biggest cases of this book is too nice to white people. The racist wizard ghost that's trying to kill her, yeah. So after he calls her an N-word bitch, they start playing chess. And at the end of the book, Letty has befriended him enough that he provides a spell that allows the whole gang to get rid of baby Braithwaite. It's gross. While I don't think Letty is well written in the show, I have to point out that there's nothing in her characterization that is as bad as that. Instead, Letty in the show rapidly descends into becoming a flat love interest. When we found out that she was a virgin, I thought we would get an exploration of how women are perceived based on how we present ourselves, and maybe looking at Letty as crafting a shell for some reason. Or better yet, Letty would be allowed to be this boisterous, adventurous, bold woman, and that wouldn't at all be tied to her sexuality. But from that moment, Letty becomes softer, and her character's axis tilts towards Atticus and almost never pivots. The book does a much better job of building relationships between people that aren't romantic. In the book, we see Letty and Ruby working together. Letty and Hippolyta's relationship is more than one scene. We see that Letty has a relationship with people who rent from her. Letty has connections beyond Atticus that are important, and that importance is made clear even though we have a brief amount of time with her. Given that the show spends more time with Letty, gives her and Atticus a subplot in almost every episode, I wish we could have spent more time building up who her character is beyond becoming Atticus's partner. A major opportunity that the show dropped was in examining Letty's connection with the spirit world. After the third episode, that isn't explored at all, and I saw that as a major way to build up Letty as an interesting character independent of Atticus. In the book, Letty's development arc isn't that grand. Honestly, nobody's is, with the exception of Ruby, ironically enough. But we do learn that Letty and Ruby's mother used to work as a medium. We also learn that she did so with a Christian twist and was low-key a scammer, and that Letty follows in her footsteps in regards to claiming that all of her behavior, dubious as it may be, is divinely decided. Point being, there is a reason to why Letty would be able to commune with ghosts, and she continues to throughout the book. It's not a one and done thing that happened. Even without that, Letty dies and is resurrected in the show. Why wasn't that used as an explanation of some change to her metaphysical being? The show instead puts a lot of focus on Letty reconnecting with Christianity, though again doesn't show the process, just the results. And to me, it's particularly confusing given that it wasn't a pastor that saved her house, but a priestess, goat blood, and chanting in Creole. Why, after exorcising the ghosts that way, does Letty lean back into Christianity instead of learning more about that woman's religion? Why did she call up that woman at all instead of looking for a Christian practitioner, priest, deacon, pastor in the first place? The decision to avoid pairing Christianity with a character who's a charlatan, I think, is in part to make Letty less of a caricature from how she's written in the book, but I also think this goes back to the morality-based changes I was talking about in the beginning of this video, and we'll be examining closer at the end as well. Given the direction the show takes with Letty and Atticus being baptized in the end, I doubt they'd want to make Christianity look bad at any point. You know what they didn't have a problem with making looking bad though? Ruby. The show went in the complete opposite direction with her character. Ruby in the book is meek, insecure. She's described as being a pushover version of her mother. She gets her confidence from the potion that turns her into a white woman, which fucking yikes, Batman. For perhaps the 20th time, I get why the writers were like, absolutely not, we have to change this. We have to make her happy within herself. As a result, they have a much better examination of the compression that Black women specifically feel. That being said, Ruby's character is still trash. In the book, her character arc is shite in that her ending is her continuing to live in her white sauna, seemingly living her best life when she's able to metaphysically cosplay as Hilaria Baldwin. Ruff's handling of race makes some patches of this book hella rough, pun intended, and one such place is with Ruby. But she's alive at the end. The show ends with Ruby dying off screen before a version of her that's actually Christina kills Letty, who is resurrected because Christina put the mark of Cain back onto her. Which, why wouldn't Christina give the mark to Ruby? Why not just incapacitate Ruby and take enough blood to make one potion so that Christina could take her place while Ruby is left behind? Like, I'm just asking for a little bit of logic with the plot armor here. When I think about what was changed, one of the few fundamental elements from the book that is not changed is the fact that Letty is skinny and light-skinned, while Ruby is plus-sized and dark-skinned. What I don't understand.
I don't understand, bitch. I don't understand.
is how nobody at any point in time considered the impact colorism would have on Ruby's storyline. Hippolyta's episode shows that somebody in the writer's room had the wherewithal to consider the impact of intersecting isms on Black women specifically. But the field of vision narrows so sharply for Ruby. It also narrows fairly dramatically for Diana, honestly. It's so frustrating that in a show that is buoyed by this ethos of caring for and about Black narratives, that its darkest characters, Ruby and Montrose, are written like shit. For Ruby, it is particularly frustrating because there are so many moments where she is shown to unabashedly care about protecting herself, and in the end, she's seemingly punished for that. I bring up Hippolyta's episode specifically because she's allowed to be selfish, and while she has to answer for that with Diana, she's not seen as forever lost after she chooses herself. It felt really icky after the finale to see a lot of people on social media saying that's what Ruby gets for sleeping with the enemy. But that reaction and even the choice in the story itself, I think highlights what it is that Ruby did that was deserving of being punished in the end. Okay, so I'm editing, as you can see in my glasses, and the thought occurred to me that a lot of people who dislike Ruby don't also acknowledge that Christina is the only person shown to continuously care for her. The show gets rid of all of Ruby's relationships except for her relationship with Christina and her relationship with Letty, where the one with Letty is shown to be kind of transactional, where her relationship with Christina is shown that this is someone who cares for her and continuously looks out for her. Ruby is seen by a lot of the audience as making a dumb choice, but when you look at the choices she was given, they weren't good. In the book, Ruby goes undercover multiple times. She participates in lodge meetings to help Caleb, and she places the disc in Lancaster's desk that limits his magic. In the show, she places the disc, and that's really it. The bulk of her story is about her relationship with Christina, outside of how Ruby can help Christina with her evil plan. Show Ruby in general is much more reluctant to spy around than Book Ruby, but Show Ruby's outcome is much more violent, even though she does fewer things to help Christina and builds up a stronger relationship with her. Beyond the absurdity of what's asked of Ruby in the end, which is, hey, can you get us a vial of blood from that person you're sleeping with? The fact that Ruby died when she decided to help her sister is both an act of betrayal from Christina that is inconsistent with what she literally said an episode prior, and it sends a message of, there is no redemption for you. There is no coming back from this. In a show that had two main characters kill an unarmed woman and two-spirit person with no reason and little to no reprimand, it is fucking absurd that the irredeemable behavior is sleeping with a white lady. I'm sorry, it is. What leads to Ruby's death is not her helping Christina. It's not her doing something that will benefit Christina that results in an ultimate punishment. It's Ruby's attempt to capitalize on her proximity in order to help her sister. Ruby is sacrificed for Letty, specifically after initiating sexy times with Christina, and nobody gives a shit. I was interested to see that Ruff wrote Letty as skinny and light-skinned and Ruby as plus-size and dark-skinned, because the inequity between the sisters is much more clearly acknowledged in the book. Part of this is because Ruby is written as weaker and complains more. Part of this is because colorism is actively ignored while also being perpetuated, but the characters are more aware that Ruby is getting the short end of the stick. Letty's last scene in the book is a conversation between her and Hippolyta, in which Letty says she thinks Ruby feels like she's being punished because after all the dust settled, Letty got a house and Ruby lost her job. This is one of the many places where colorism could have been unpacked, but at the very least, it shows an imbalance in the outcomes between the sisters that Letty herself is aware of, which is missing from the show. And ultimately, I think makes Ruby a character that audiences aren't supposed to sympathize with, because even people within the story don't care about her. Speaking of sympathy, I did a video on the desirable dark-skinned woman trope, and in it mentioned that sitting on a pink dick is often the major fatal flaw for dark-skinned Black women in television. I'm going to link that video if you want more context about that, but illustratively, we often see villainous or antagonistic dark-skinned black women partnered with white men. And that partnership is both at the root of their eventual failing and functions as a signal to the audience of, hey, you know how this lady is full of shit? She's willing to fuck a white man. Ruby is another occurrence of this, and I think it's worth noting that the show put more energy into her relationship with Christina and William than the book did. While the consent question in the book is worse because Caleb seems to have used magic to coerce Ruby, the sexual aspect of their relationship doesn't last for nearly as long, and Ruby actually doesn't tell anybody about the extent of her relationship with Caleb or what it is he even has her do, versus the show choosing to center her character around Christina in a way that eventually leads to her death. Just an interesting change, not at all also meant to help us transition into talking about Christina. Christina is the other major character whose gender is switched, being Caleb Braithwaite in the book, though I don't understand why. In the book, the Wizards of White Supremacy include women as major members. In fact, Ruby's Whitestone masquerades as a representative from a minor branch at one point. But the show removes that and makes the cloaked Caucasian casters of spells a boys-only club to introduce white feminism, but then doesn't even really provide as scathing a critique as they could, as we see in Hippolyta's episode, where we unpack the way that even the people who love us can contribute to our reduction. So it's just kind of like, why put this here if you aren't going to really say anything about it, you know? Also, both in the show and the book, baby Braithwaite doesn't have that great of a motivation. In the book, it's kind of unclear. He wants to be the head wizard because his dad is mean, I guess. Caleb actually is the greatest example of this book being too kind to white people. And I think it is most evident in the fact that his villainy is pretty softballed. The ceremony that Atticus is needed for drives Lancaster, the evil zombie cop, more than baby Braithwaite. It's really disappointing. There are so many moments in the book where Caleb could have turned, and he never really does. Versus in the show, Christina is much more selfish, much more villainous, less of a morally gray savior, which I like. I like that her character had a bit more bite, a bit more reason to doing all the fuck shit than Caleb did. I just thought the sexism angle was really weakly done, and I felt like we didn't need it because it left me questioning why Christina needed to be a woman. Like, is it just for this? Or better yet, I didn't understand why she needed to have William. William does exist in the book, but he's more like the Alfred of the Lodge House, and he doesn't look like the Braithwaites at all. In the show, it's hella unclear who he is. I remember there's a scene where Christina describes him as the rightful heir or some shit, but again, I feel like his existence would have stuck out more to more people than just Lancaster if it was true. So what's the point? We never see how being a man specifically benefits Christina. She can't participate in any Sons of Adam stuff when she's William, so the major benefit that she gets in being William is that she can hit on Ruby and sleep with Ruby, and I will cover my issues with that later. Ultimately, baby Braithwaite, whether it's Caleb or Christina, is an antagonist with a fairly weak motivation, even if one's end goal is clearer than the others. Plus, the moments when we are supposed to care about this character in either story feel like a waste of time or really disgusting, just entirely unnecessary. You know who is a character with interesting and complex motivation? Gia, who doesn't exist in the book. I think her episode is one of the best. I loved the arc of learning who she is and what she is, watching her learn that she can grow affection, that she is more than a monster in a shell. It would have been great if they had taken more time to explore the concept she introduced of being a monster or a hero, especially in regards to justifying killing certain people. But because they don't, her character and her episode feels really out of place, which is ironic because her episode fits the spirit of the book the most. We experience the world through Gia only, no B plots, and other main characters only matter so much as how they interact with her, if they ever do. If the show had consistently kept the book's structure of point of view, I think her character could have blended into the show so much better. But when she popped up in the finale, I was kind of like, why are you here? This might be more of a plot thing, but there are certain threads, Tick's birthmark, Ruby eavesdropping on Letty sharing Hippolyta's location, the George Montrose Dora triangle, that don't matter outside of the episode in which they occur and barely matter even within that one. Gia's conversation with the shaman is one of those threads. Why does it matter that she can't kill Tick? Why does what the shaman told her mean that Gia eventually needs to go to Chicago? Because it's her destiny? That feels really lazy, especially for a character that's supposed to introduce a complex conversation about morality and motivation. But it feels like the main reason she is introduced is so that we can have an exploration of Atticus's backstory. All roads lead back to Atticus, and I think this is in part why her episodes stuck out to so many people as odd. The show up until this point had been telling us that we only care about side characters insofar as how they interact with Atticus, or we will get a major subplot of the episode dedicated to him. Gia's episode is the only one to flip that, and while I love that it made her more than this haunting, shape-shifting memory, the fact that it didn't land with viewers points to the failure of the show to adequately build interest in characters and their arcs throughout the show as a whole. Thinking about how the writers built viewers' investment is key to the answer of the major question I had throughout all of this, which was, why make these changes? Some changes are specific to characters, like the creation of Gia to have an exploration of Atticus's backstory, or the death of Uncle George to facilitate Montrose as the key father figure. But I think the changes are meant to shift the center of moral goodness and by extension alter who we should be sympathetic to, who we should invest in, and why. Mostly the sense of moral good, the way it's established what direction our compass should be pointing in, explains which characters are worth saving no matter what, which characters are worth mourning, what actions are acceptable even if they don't make sense for the character because their place on the moral spectrum should deem them as sympathetic or not, regardless of what happens. I think this is most blatantly done with the depictions of class, religion, and sexuality. For class and religion, in part, some of these adjustments are probably made to make the characters a bit more digestible, but I think it also sheds light on the intended audience. The writers were targeting viewers who would enjoy seeing the main characters get baptized over having a Christian charlatan, for example. As for sexuality, for all the acclaim this show might get for introducing queer characters and storylines, the majority of them die or are written to never be seen again, which does not bode well for what that means on where LGBTQ plus people fit on the spectrum of morality. Part of Ruby's ending feeling like a punishment is feeling like she's punished for not fitting within a mold. More than partnering with a white person, it's her engaging physically with Christina as Christina that precludes her death. Compare the end of her storyline to the end of Montrose's, where, again, in episode 9, he has this monologue about wanting to have a son in order to reinforce his masculinity. By the end, it feels like Montrose is again packing away a part of himself in order to be someone acceptable. Maybe he's healed a bit more from his trauma after reliving it, and the characters felt that having him relive his trauma was enough to tie up his sexuality arc. But I've mentioned before that I think it's odd that we don't see Montrose with Sammy during that scene in the finale where all the other main characters are interacting with the person they care about the most. Looking back, I think it's because the show wanted to leave us with the image of Montrose as Tick's father first. In that way, Montrose can fit into the mold of an altruistic patriarch much more easily, just like Letty can fit into the mold of a dynamic damsel, just like Hippolyta can fit into the mold of a fearless mother. Ruby is not watered down into a positive archetype. Instead, she's made into a scapegoat. It's because of this that certain parts of her storyline feel like a blatant decision to make her character more unlikable by pushing her further outside of the viewer's comfort zone. And there's no effort to pull Ruby back. Once she's pushed out, she's marked as not worth saving. And Montrose receives a redemption in the storyline when he leans heavily into being a father in a way that doesn't allow him to also be with Sammy. We can have queer characters that have difficult motivation that are antagonists, but they should also be rounded. And Ruby is not that. Christina and Montrose are not that. Given that these characters are the source of a majority of the interpersonal doom and gloom, it's interesting to look at the similarities in the ways that they are set up as undesirable and thus easier to villainize at different points in the story, and what changes are made when and if they are redeemed. All of that, the value system that marks them as bad, is working in tandem with the value system that says what makes somebody good, what types of behavior you should be moving closer to. The story didn't just happen to flow in this direction. They wrote it this way. The writers made the decision to make Ruby's relationship with Christina central to her story, to make Montrose gay, to have Hippolyta find herself in the multiverse, to send Letty on a religious journey, to create Gia. And ultimately, I think it was to have the emotional pull of the show based in the sense of morality, which isn't bad at face value. Establishing a moral compass in your show isn't a bad thing, but in Lovecraft Country, it led to an overdependence on shock value and a few dramatic scenes to glean a sense of a character's fleeting, lackluster personality and motivation instead of just developing the character well from the beginning. It kind of feels like the characters are just put into a bucket of good or bad and pulled out when needed. Like we need a good character to do this thing, so who can we use? Even if there's no build up to this behavior, or the behavior doesn't make sense for who we've seen this specific character to be, because you are marked as good or bad, you are free to use for any of the actions that fit into the corresponding category. This also helps explain a bit of the inconsistency to me. If the goal is to sculpt characters vaguely enough to fit into one bucket or the other, we gotta keep this person's force aura in the red. Girl, even if it's gray, gotta be gray with a tinge. Then the details of the character, let alone tracking those details over the course of the season so that their progression makes sense, doesn't really matter as much. In the end, the story becomes less about who these characters are and what they're experiencing, and more about what they can symbolize at any given time. If you made it to the end, thank you for making it to the end. Have you watched this show or read this book? How do you feel about it? I feel like this show has some pretty polarizing opinions from people, though typically based in the plot, not the character development. It was nice to dust off my little dinky English degree for this lopsided deep dive, but yeah, I'm good on this show for a hot while. I'm recording this on the new moon, also Founders Day. I'm recording this on the new moon. The sun is shining, the tank is clean, the president is hopefully being impeached. It's prime time for intention setting. I'm going to try and move forward with a commitment to openly question things a bit more. Quoth Evelyn from the internets, don't be afraid to be seen trying. We'll see how it goes. Until next time, stay safe. I'll catch you in the next echo chamber.